Welcome to Fast Intelligent Care, the podcast for occupational therapists who want to make a real impact. Every Tuesday, we bring you fresh ideas, clear insights, and practical solutions in assistive technology. Let's make smarter, faster, and more effective care simple. Your journey starts now. In today's episode, we're going to be digging into the essential considerations when using slings, from clients with poor skin integrity to those living with involuntary movements and even amputees. So if you've ever thought, how do I make sure I'm choosing the right sling for the right person? This episode is for you. We do also have an episode on some general assessment considerations when you're selecting slings, but today's episode is going to focus on those rare special cases where your standard slings just aren't going to do the job. So why does sling choice matter? Getting sling selection right is critical. Slings are very important pieces of equipment. They're not just about moving people from A to B, but it needs to be comfortable. The person needs to have protection for their skin. They need to feel dignified and that their privacy is respected, and they need to have proper positioning. Now, using the wrong sling or using it the wrong way can lead to pressure injuries, pain, or unsafe transfers. Today, we'll break down key areas where you need to think twice before reaching for that sling. Our first special consideration is a client with poor skin integrity. Now, if I was to use just a normal sling, there's going to be quite a lot of sling application. And with sling application, we get a lot of friction and shear against the skin because we're inserting and taking out a sling quite often, especially if we're doing a lot of transfers throughout the day. We want to try and minimize that skin tears or friction against the skin, but we also don't want to leave the sling underneath the client, because what happens is that the sling isn't a stretchable material. It's also typically not breathable, especially your standard polyester slings, which means if I leave it underneath the client, they're not going to get the benefits of their pressure care cushion or pressure care mattress. They're not going to get that optimal immersion and envelopment from the cushion, because it's going to be like a tight hammock effect where they're actually going to be prevented from fully going into that pressure care support system. And with it also not being very breathable, it can increase heat and moisture around the skin with sweating, and that's going to also make the skin more vulnerable to breakdown. Clients that could have poor skin integrity could be your elderly clients, clients with thin and fragile skin, could also be your clients with paraplegia or quadriplegia that have reduced sensation and also have a higher risk of developing pressure injuries, or even clients with circulatory issues. And this could be something like diabetes. So some considerations when we're looking at slings is we want something that's soft, breathable, low friction fabrics like a slide sheet type of material or a ripstop nylon fabric. We also want to look at slings that are seamless or have a low seam design to avoid those pressure points when we're leaving the sling underneath the client. Or we want to look at a sling that is easy to take out and put back in, that is not going to cause as much friction and shear against the skin. And this is where that kind of slide sheet material comes in. We also want to look at things like padded leg sections to reduce shear on the thighs. So a lot of slings aren't padded, it's just a single layer of fabric. And what tends to happen is that once the person's lifted, that fabric falls on itself and then becomes like a rope that then digs into the person's skin and then causes a lot of friction and shear against the skin. So we rather want to have padded leg supports that maintain its structure and is a lot more supportive and comfortable for larger thighs or someone that does have that poor skin integrity. Now we have two types of slings that could be suitable for this type of client. So we could look at in-situ sling, which is a sling that we can leave underneath the client for extended periods of time. Now there's no specific amount of time, specific recommended hours for how long you can leave the sling underneath the client. It is going to depend on your client's specific condition or specific skin integrity. You might have a client that will be fine to have the sling underneath him for 3 to 4 hours, but another client, he might just be able to leave it for an hour or two. So definitely do regular skin checks and make sure that you reduce the amount of time that the sling's underneath them if you do find red marks or red areas that is indicating that there's high pressure points or that they're not getting proper skin perfusion. Another sling that you could look at is your multi-fit reflex sling. This is a sling that has very large, oversized, padded leg supports, and the material on the back of the sling as well as the leg supports is called a ripstop nylon fabric or a slide sheet material type of fabric. The fabric that we'd have for the leave-in sling is called a 3D spacer material, and what's good about this material is that it is a lot more breathable and vapor permeable. So whenever we're looking at leave-in slings or slings that are easier to apply, we need to look at what type of fabric we're using. According to the National Pressure Injury Advisory Panel, slings should not be left under clients unless they're specifically designed for that purpose. And this is where the in-situ sling offers breathable and cushioned materials that reduce risks of pressure injuries. But always assess skin condition daily, even when using the leave-in slings or in-situ slings. You'll also find that the in-situ sling doesn't have handles at the back of the sling, and this is also to reduce how many seams or pressure points we have when that sling is being left underneath the client. Something that's also important to note is that with your in-situ sling, it doesn't have the leg supports, the divided leg supports. It is like a hammock type sling, which means it might be suitable for your double above knee amputees, but because it doesn't have the leg supports and it needs to go all the way behind the knees, you can only fit it from a lying position. So you wouldn't be able to fit the sling with the person sitting in a chair. They would have to be transferred to their bed first, and then you can apply the sling with the roll method and then put them into a chair and then leave the sling underneath them and then transfer them from chair to commode or chair to recliner chair. And then once that person needs to do any hygiene activities or activities where they're going to get wet, we would take the sling out. And then we'd have to use either another sling like your hygiene or access slings and then put the person back in bed to reapply the in-situ sling. Because you'll find that the in-situ sling doesn't have a commode aperture, which means that we can't remove clothing while they're in the sling, which means the sling can get wet or can get swirled if it's not removed for toileting purposes. So just a recap, our in-situ or leave-in slings are designed to stay under the client between transfers, but not all slings are suitable for this. You would consider in-situ slings when you have a client that requires frequent repositioning, someone that requires repeated handling, which could damage the skin, or a client that's very difficult to take the sling in and out, and also clients that are bedbound or at a high risk for pressure injuries. So this could be your clients with fragile skin and thin skin. Always check that not all leave-in slings may be created equal. The National Pressure Injury Advisory Panel highlights that while in-situ slings can enable frequent repositioning, they might interfere with therapeutic mattresses if they're not properly designed. Material needs to be air permeable and its construction is very critical. It needs to have that multi-way stretch as well. So make sure that you balance repositioning needs or a sling application and pressure injury risk. Our next special consideration is clients with involuntary movements. So imagine a client with spasticity, high muscle tone, or involuntary movements that are unsafe in a sling or in a hoist. Because what you'll find is that that movement, for let's say for example it's an extensive spasm, will be transferred through the hoist and then could actually make the hoist unstable and it could actually topple over. So we want to look at a sling that can transfer the movement through the sling loops instead of through the hoist. So look for slings that have what we call a reflex shoulder strap or shoulder loop, which allows for a dynamic adjustment. So you'll see then that if the person does do that extensive spasm, that the loop will move and the hoist will stay stable. However, if we had our standard loops, which are multiple short loops, there's not a lot of movement going through those loops, and then that movement is rather going through the hoist. We also want to have an integrated head support, because if we do have someone that has an involuntary movement, they might be moving the head and neck as well, and we want to have something that's supportive. Now, consideration with head supports is that some clients don't like it because they feel like it's closed in and they can't see, and when their visual field is restricted, it can increase anxiety. And with a lot of clients with that abnormal muscle tone, their tone can actually increase if they're anxious. So you want to look at a head support that isn't too high. So something that's kind of up to ear level, but they can still see outside of the sling. So they still have a little bit of a visual field, peripheral vision. They can possibly look at their caregivers, even make eye contact with the caregiver, which will help them stay calm and reduce any increase in muscle tone. We also want to look at a low friction fabric, so something like your ripstop nylon or slide sheet type of material, which makes application of slings easier, makes it easy to get a sling underneath a client that does have that abnormal tone, involuntary movements, which is going to make sling application generally quite difficult. And it makes it also very easy to remove the sling when needed. You'll find that with your multi-fit reflex sling, which is designed for clients with involuntary movements, it also has these oversized padded leg supports, which means that the person's going to have a lot of support by their hips, but there's going to be a bit more movement by the shoulder area to allow for that extensive spasm. So if you imagine a client with cerebral palsy, they might have that extensive spasm, and they might need to allow for that movement in the sling, but still maintain a flexed hip position so that you can break that or inhibit that muscle tone and make sure that they're still safe and secure in the sling, that they don't slip out. So we still want to avoid the person slipping forward with this sling. So you will find that it has divided leg supports, that has a modesty loop that keeps the legs supports together, that they don't splay the legs open, and that there's a chance the person can slide through or slip through the commode aperture. Our next consideration are sling options for clients with amputations. Transferring amputees does require specialized slings because we can't necessarily always use those divided leg supports, especially if someone has a very high above knee amputation. Might not be safe because they could also be too big of a commode aperture that they can then slip through. So when you're looking for slings for an amputee, you might look at a hammock type sling, like your in-situ sling, or you could look at slings that have the option to be configured to be a hammock type sling, which could be something like your Quick Fit Deluxe sling, which has these kind of square sides instead of the rounded leg supports. And that means that they can be crossed over each other, and that then makes it a hammock type sling instead of having two leg supports. And this is a special configuration that you can't get with all slings. So always make sure that when you're looking at a sling, that it does have that option to be configured, which is almost like a cradle type of position. So the straps are crossed over each other instead of holding the legs separately. You also do want to have sufficient padding to reduce any pressure points on the stumps or residual limbs. You also want to make sure that if you do have something like your hammock type sling, your in-situ sling, it's good if you have a pommel that can still prevent the person from sliding out. In some cases, you might have a sling that doesn't have the pommel, which will prevent the person from sliding out. And this is where you might want to have your client in a more reclined sling position. And you can achieve this by having slightly longer shoulder loops. So instead of a very upright position with short shoulder loops, you make them a bit longer, and you might even make your leg loops shorter, and then you'll kind of have this tilted back reclined position. So that means gravity will keep the person towards the back of the sling, and it will be unlikely for them to slip forward out of the sling. But always perform individual risk assessments for your clients that have any amputations. So let's do a recap and go through our key takeaways from today's episode. When your client has poor skin integrity, use breathable, low friction, padded, and seamless design slings, like your in-situ or multi-fit reflex sling. If your client has involuntary movement, you want to look at a sling that's secure, supportive, and allows for dynamic adjustment or for movement to be transferred through the sling loops instead of through the hoist. Then we looked at clients with amputations, and in this case, we look at hammock type slings or slings that can be configured into a hammock type sling, like your in-situ sling, as well as your Quick Fit Deluxe. And lastly, always remember to look at your guidelines, such as your National Pressure Injury Advisory Panel, that informs you on sling selection for clients with poor skin integrity, and make sure that you trial slings and do a careful, individualized risk assessment before selecting a sling. If you want any additional support with sling selection, go onto our YouTube channel where you'll find a video that will go through our sling selector tool on the OT app. Just a bonus on today's episode, when we talk about hygiene slings, these are slings that are not suitable for all clients. Hygiene slings have a big commode aperture, which allows for clothing to be removed and reapplied and allows for toileting purposes. However, the sling usually has a very low back support and is really important that the client has good trunk control. They're not a floppy individual, or they have sufficient muscle tone, and they have a FIM score above 1. If they are a FIM score 1, which means they're fully dependent on their caregivers for support, which means they're doing 25% or less effort in a transfer, they're not going to be suitable for a hygiene sling. There has been research conducted on the use of hygiene slings, and it's actually been found that only about 25% of clients that use slings are suitable for a hygiene sling. And this is also because hygiene slings are only suitable for certain body shapes. So when you look at a client that has an apple shape, they might not be suitable for the sling. And if they have a pear shape, it is not compatible because this client can actually slip through because of where the weight is distributed on their body. So when you are considering a sling, make sure that it's suitable for your client's specific needs. Make sure you trial. And remember, unfortunately, slings aren't a one-size-fits-all. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. Have you heard of any of these slings before or seen any similar type slings? We'd love to know how your experience has been with these, and if you've had any successful trials, or even if you've had some not so successful trials, we'd still love to hear from you. Thanks for joining us on Fast Intelligent Care. We hope you're leaving with fresh insights and tools to make a real impact as an occupational therapist. If you've got questions or topics you'd like us to cover, we'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to subscribe and join us every Tuesday for more ideas and strategies to deliver smarter, faster, and better care. Until next time, keep making a difference.